Hello and welcome to Projector, and on this episode, Mason Thames learns how to train your dragon in this live-action remake. On the Isle of Berk, Vikings and dragons have fought for generations, with Stoic the Vast, played by Gerard Butler, being the most famed dragon slayer of all. But his scrawny son Hiccup, played by Mason Thames, struggles to live up to his father's expectations, but one of his inventions injures one of the most feared and mysterious kinds of dragons, a Night Fury. But Hiccup can't bring himself to kill the Night Fury, which he names Toothless, and instead secretly helps, studies and trains the dragon, soon realising that everything the people of Berk know about dragons is wrong. For the past 15 years, we have been inundated with Disney remaking their classic animated films in live action, kicked off by the box office success of Alice in Wonderland, but went into high gear from Cinderella onward. And these remakes are a pretty contentious subject. Some, like The Jungle Book, were praised, but the most notorious were ones like The Lion King, which was almost identical to the original, with the vivid and evocative 2D drawings stripped away by realistic CGI animation that repainted everything in muted greys. Despite that, The Lion King was one of the most highest grossing films of that year, and I think I've made my feelings pretty apparent on these remakes several times over the years. So it's perhaps gloomily inevitable that Disney's closest rival, DreamWorks Animation, smelling all that green, would follow in their footsteps. Enter How to Train Your Dragon 2025, which is the first live-action project from DreamWorks Animation, not to be confused with their former parent studio, DreamWorks SKG, which they split from in 2004. And when they announced they would be remaking How to Train Your Dragon in live action, I can sum up my exact response to that in one word. Really? The How to Train Your Dragon trilogy are some of the most critically acclaimed animated films in recent memory. I do mean very recent memory, by the way, as the third film, which conclusively wrapped up the story, if slightly disappointingly, only came out 6 years ago in 2019. I even reviewed it on this channel at the time. And I do have to admit, I was a bit dismissive of the original film when it came out in 2010 and didn't see it theatrically because it was marketed like a generic kids film. It was only later when I caught up with it was I surprised by not only the spectacular animation, but also the unexpected emotional weight of the story. This was something that was only expanded upon further by the sequel, which is the high point of this franchise, which took some daring choices for something primarily aimed at young viewers. But regardless of your age, the animated How to Train Your Dragon movies are great films that show the ability of animation to tell compelling stories for every age. They're family movies in the truest sense. They thrive not in spite of the medium of animation, but very much because of it, from the astonishing fantasy worlds to the expressiveness of the characters and their designs. And maybe that's the thing that's grown to annoy me, and I know it does many others, that these live-action remakes seem to treat the fact that these stories were animated as a problem to be solved, like it was somehow illegitimate until they were made real. So let's be clear, animation is just as valid as live action. Both are just vessels to tell stories, and some stories work better in one medium than they do the other. What I will say, though, is that there is something about animation that can be so universally expressive. Movies like Flow and Robot Dreams had me in floods of tears without a single word of dialogue. Thinking that animation is for kids and live action is for grown-ups is that of cynical teenagers and jaded adults, and it's a shallow and frankly stupid opinion. Still, for a few brief moments, I suppose there was a little nagging counter-argument in my mind that the movies bore very little resemblance to the book series written by Cressida Cow. In theory, a new series of adaptations could go back to the source material to do something more like the books. That was largely dashed when it was announced that Dean Dubois, who co-wrote and directed the original 2010 film and primary writer-director of the sequels, would reprise his role in the director's chair, which effectively indicated that this would likely be the same movie over again. Dubois also rather boldly gets a solo writing credit for a script which is largely identical to the one which was previously credited to two other writers, but hey, I'm not the WGA. Dubois is certainly no stranger to live-action remakes, given only a few weeks ago, the live-action version of Lilo and Stitch released, and Dubois co-directed the original animated film with Chris Sanders, who co-wrote and directed the 2010 How to Train Your Dragon. And Dubois has gone to major lengths, even by the standards of these redos, to make sure he's made an almost identical film again. He's got composer John Powell back in to effectively repeat the themes he created for the original animated trilogy. He has Gerard Butler reprising his role as Stoic that he originally voiced, and now he's physically playing the character. And it is a good performance. His role in the Dragon films is some of Butler's best film work, but it is him effectively giving the same performance he gave 15 years ago, much as how James Earl Jones did in the do-over of The Lion King. But Dubois has even gone to the extent of often painstakingly and exactly replicating as much as possible from the earlier animated films. The sets and props try to copy their animated counterparts, the designs of the dragons are largely identical, with Toothless in particular being virtually unchanged. And as much as Toothless is absolutely adorable with his cat-like features and mannerisms, I did find that he's stuck out more in live action because he has the big-eyed expressiveness of an animated character that feels much more at home within those original films where everything looks like that. Toothless, dare I say it, maybe should have had a sensitive redesign that tried to maintain those key features but given it a more photoreal appearance. Dubois also straight up copies the exact dialogue and performances, sometimes even the framing, so that in many instances this is a straight up line-for-line remake. You could almost have the original film play out side by side with the new one and see how close they are, which is literally what I'm doing right now in editing. It is almost a complete clone of the earlier work. And having endured the Disney remakes for so long, I think some people have forgotten what the purpose of a remake should actually be. There does seem to be some that seem to think the reason these remakes are bad is because they change things, and that fidelity is the sign of a good remake. On the contrary, the entire point for a remake is to try and change things. Sure, remakes can be bad when they change things poorly, but a remake that serves to be a copycat is an abject failure because that movie already exists. There's a reason why Gus Van Sant's shot-for-shot Psycho was universally mocked and remains a byword for bad, unnecessary remakes. But try to think of some of the most notable and best movie remakes over the years. Things like Scarface, The Fly, The Thing, The Invisible Man, The Nutty Professor. Okay, I'm kind of joking about that last one. Or am I? The point is, though, these movies were bold reinventions of their predecessors, ones that were so successful that in several cases they supplanted their predecessors. They added fresh new angles on the original stories that expanded upon their core themes and ideas. And I personally would much rather have something that tried to do things differently and fail than not try at all. At least that thing has its own identity, something to set itself apart from the earlier movie. Movies are not sacred objects, they're stories, and we've iterated on stories from the moment we started telling them, but this cycle of hyper-faithful remakes and franchises repeating their old glories has created a worrying blockbuster stagnancy that this so-called new How to Train Your Dragon is at the forefront of. Movie executives are terrified of change, and even more so because there are vocal segments of the audience who are also terrified of anything changing in this perverse feedback loop. Remakes also serve to modernise and update stories, but that doesn't really apply to something which is only 15 years old. If you wanted to be charitable, at least Disney remade films that were 20, 30 years old, so you can make the argument that the kids who saw the original films became parents that were introducing those stories to their kids. But not enough time has passed here for even that argument to work. And Dubois makes so few substantial changes that he clearly thought he'd done a very good job the first time around. And he's right, he did, which makes this all the more spectacularly pointless and redundant. The cardinal sin of How to Train Your Dragon 2025 isn't that it's a poorly made remake. Far from it. Dubois' first live-action narrative feature is solidly directed, has very high production values, and is mostly a very well-produced movie. It would be a good film by most standards if it wasn't for the fact that it's derivative in nearly every single decision it makes. Almost an unfathomable amount of time, money, effort, and resources, around $150 million reportedly, has gone into making the world's most expensive carbon copy. It borders on the frankly obscene when you think about what this could have made instead. Which begs the question, why exactly does this exist? Well, aside from the obvious one of trying to hoover up money from people's nostalgia and affection for the franchise, that is. Well, one of them is that they've created a new Isle of Berg attraction at Universal Studios Florida. It's one of the epic universes that have opened there this year. The film is a very expensive tie-in and cross-promotion for that, and they've made no secret about that, as one of the promo videos is the cast and Dubois visiting the admittedly pretty cool-looking attraction. The other, and this is pure speculation on my part, but I suspect the other reason this got made is because Universal and DreamWorks want to hold onto the film rights for the books, because if they aren't using the license, it will expire. I don't have any evidence for that, but we know how this stuff works. For example, it's been admitted that The Bourne Legacy was made so that Universal could retain that series for a few years until Matt Damon could return. Likewise, it would not surprise me if Dubois directed this, because he's often admitted how very personal this series is to him and reflects the relationship he had with his own father. So if he wanted to protect his own creation, if Universal was set on remaking this with or without him, of course he's going to sign up. Again, that's purely speculation, and it's not like he's going to admit that on the press tour, but it would certainly go some way to explain why this deliberately tries to alter as little as possible. Regardless, this film's existence feels like it's not by need, but by corporate mandate. Speaking of roller coasters, I actually saw this in the 4DX format because they've been especially pushing the premium format versions. It was filmed for IMAX, so you get the full aspect ratio there, but they've also been promoting the 4DX version, and it's pretty easy to see why. The 4DX application is extremely aggressive, especially in the test flight sequence, swooping through the rocks, and in the climax. I was getting jostled and thrown around intensely, and so much smoke is pumped into the auditorium during the film, there was actually diffraction in the projection near the end. But one thing that 4DX does very well is flying scenes, and in those moments, you genuinely feel like you're soaring through the air riding Toothless as the seat tilts and the wind blows through your hair. I enjoyed parts of the 4DX more than the film itself, but you can easily re-release the original and just apply these effects onto it. It's not a justification for a new film. And if it seems like I'm talking about why the film exists more than the film itself, there is a reason for that. There really isn't all that much to say about it. Have you seen the 2010 How to Train Your Dragon? Well, then you've seen this one. That pretty much sums things up. So, what exactly does this new version alter? Well, the most significant change is the tone. The live-action film is darker, especially visually, compared to the brightly coloured animated film, a change you'll have no doubt anticipated if you've ever seen any of these remakes. Filmed in Belfast and making gorgeous use of the scenery at times, Dragon 2025 often looks like Game of Thrones, which was also filmed there. I'm not sure that really fits the tone of the story, and it is occasionally a bit murky, but it is a major difference. But this is also reflected in the fact that a lot of the broader, more cartoonish gags of the 2010 flick are eliminated and removed. For example, Hiccup doesn't faint after his first encounter with Toothless, and some small comedy scenes have been eliminated entirely because of this, like Hiccup trying to sneak Toothless into the village. There are some gags which are retained, but a lot of the more incidental humour is gone now. In their place, the film does add several additional scenes of its own, and it does run about 30 minutes longer. Some of this does go towards the supporting characters, like the other teenagers in training, who get marginally more depth and dialogue. The most prominent of these, and that's not really saying much, is that Gabriel Howe's Snoutlout struggles to even be noticed by his father Spitalout, an added character played by Peter Serafinowicz, which ostensibly amplifies the father-son themes. But this plays out in a small selection of extremely minor scenes, and if you add them all together, I don't think the screen time would add to much more than about 2 minutes, tops. And that's the thing. The new version is longer, but it isn't any deeper, and Dubois doesn't take the opportunity to expand upon the core ideas when the exchanges between Hiccup and Stoic are word for word verbatim, and the new ideas don't go anywhere because they're simply bolt-ons. The citizens of Berk are now not entirely Vikings, and now they're representatives from all over the world, so the implication is that this serves as a strategic outpost against dragons and adds a bit more representation as well, but it's tokenistic because it's almost instantly forgotten. Most of the alterations are so minor as to be almost incidental, like the sheep grabbed at the start is now a decoy, although a few of the choices are just plain odd. When Astrid is picked up by Toothless, he originally strands her on top of a tree. The remake relocates this so she's now perilously hanging on the side of a cliff, which makes it seem like Toothless is trying to murder her? Yeah, that's not really much of a choice in that situation. Either get on this dragon or fall to your death. Much of the added time is just down to pacing, which is slower in the 2025 incarnation. A lot of the added running time is in the action sequences, like the opening attack on Berk is bigger and longer, and the climax is also lengthened and more bombastic. Sometimes these little bits of breathing room help in those action moments, but most of the time the slower pacing hurts the film. A new sequence of Stoic's boat being attacked as he searches for the dragon's lair is just there to give Butler some more screen time and add an action beat, but it adds nothing to the story. There's a reason why it was only implied in passing originally. Comparatively, the 2010 movie feels lighter and faster on its feet, with very little bloat on it. The other thing that sets this version apart are the performances. As far as Hiccup goes, Mason Thames on the Black Phone is perfectly fine, but he's not as sincerely awkward or as gawky as Jay Baruchel's voice work, so he kind of feels like a Disney Child TV movie version of the character. There are two definite standouts in the cast though. One is Nick Frost as Gobber, who gives the character a much more world-weary but genuinely caring edge than Craig Ferguson's take. Again, toning down the slapstick of the character, but Frost adds a bit of dramatic grit while still retaining some of the humour, and Frost's performance might actually be an improvement, but it just goes to show that even with most of the same dialogue, you can still have two totally different performances because there's far more to acting than just saying the words. The other one is Nico Parker as Hiccup's rival and love interest, Astrid, originally played by America Ferrera. Parker, who is the absolute spitting image of her mother, Tandaway Newton, is no stranger to remakes as she previously appeared in Dumbo, but she's excellently cast as Astrid, really selling the character's strong self-reliance and determination, and Parker already has an undeniable screen presence that sets her apart from the other young cast. I think she's genuinely one to look out for, because I really don't think it will be long before she'll be leading films of her own. Hopefully ones that aren't remakes. The 2025 How to Train Your Dragon is an extremely faithful facsimile of a fairly recent film to begin with. Fans will find that some of the heart remains intact, the story's core themes of father-son relationships, compassion and understanding still resonate here, but a lot of the soul is missing because it forces itself to do everything almost exactly the way it was, almost to the point of being mechanical. That forces viewers to constantly compare it to the original, and it always comes up wanting. Even for new viewers, kids and adults alike, I can't recommend you choose this as your introduction to this world when there is a superior version very easily available. And if you're a fan of the original, you'll no doubt have a copy of it at home, so you don't need to bother seeing this at all. It is the same movie, but I rewatched the 2010 animated film for this review after I saw the remake, and it remains stirringly triumphant and uplifting. There's a pure joy to it that this can't touch. Stay home and watch that instead. And I am fully aware that me advising people not to see this won't make a damn bit of difference because Universal is already expecting this to be such a hit that they've already announced they're going to remake the sequel months before this reached cinemas. And it is infuriating to hear that something like the Lilo and Stitch remake has outgrossed the original film's entire run within days. But that speaks to A, just how much these films have come to be adored, and B, just how big of a family market there is. Do parents want absolute retreads of the films they grew up with? I'm not really convinced, but the success of these films comes down to the fact that for many family audiences, these remakes are usually the only option they're given at the cinema that are family friendly. It's a huge, hungry audience that is massively underserved, and they deserve better than microwave reheat instead of stories for their own generation. But if you can, support things like Elio, an original Disney film, over things like this, which are as regurgitated as the fish from Toothless's mouth. This is up there with The Lion King in terms of sheer needlessness, but maybe it's even more than that, since it is the same director, composer, script, shots, even the same actors. The original made you feel like you could fly. This remake is so dispiriting, and its crown of being the most pointless remake is going to get very quickly usurped by the Moana one very soon. If you like this review and you want to support my work, you can give me a tip at my Ko-fi page, or my YouTube Super Thanks feature, which is right below the video. Or you can blaze a trail over at my Patreon, where you can see my videos early among other perks, including access to my Discord server, and you can also join YouTube memberships with similar perks. Or you can just simply like, share and subscribe, it all helps. Until next time, I'm Matthew Buck, fading out.